Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team, Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 69th lecture of our lecture series. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of academic study of Indian languages and literatures envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. Later in 2005, a new department called Comparative Indian Languages and Literatures was established, which still continues to carry research in Indian languages. Calcutta Comparatives 1919 took inspiration from this history. It is a platform for sharing research interests and ideas. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Your remarkable skills will be a great addition to our team. We look forward to a mutually beneficial relationship with you. Thank you for joining us today. Now I would request Jemima Di to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Shuporna. I feel immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Today we have with us Rajarshee Gupta. Rajarshee Gupta is an assistant professor of English at Subhas Chandra Bose Centenary College in West Bengal, India. He is currently a doctoral research scholar at Department of English, University of Calcutta. He has done his MA and MPhil from the same department. Post-colonial studies, Indology, Tagore studies, translation studies, and popular literature and culture are his areas of interest. He has translated many short stories from continental and English literature into Bengali, which have been published in various Bengali magazines and websites. An annotated anthology of Emma James's ghost stories translated by him titled Chaya Kaya Bhoy has been published in 2019. Now I welcome Rajarshee Gupta to this floor. Now this virtual stage is yours. You may begin his lecture.
Thank you, Jamima. Good evening to everybody. Thanks to Calcutta Comparatists 1919 for inviting me to this discussion session. The topic of today's discussion is the double trouble, the Doppelganger Motif in Satyajit Ray's fiction. Now, Satyajit Ray, the author, is much less discussed than Satyajit Ray, the filmmaker. At least, definitely so outside the Bengali reader circle. But this goes without saying that beside being one of the most successful editors in the history of Bengali literature, because he rejuvenated the most prestigious children's magazine, Sandesh, established by his eminent grandfather, Gopta Chaudhuri, in the 1960s. He is also one of the pioneers of speculative fiction in Bengali. Satyajit Ray was an avid reader of Western popular literature, of various genres of popular literature, horror, science, fantasy, science fiction, and many to name them. And therefore, many motifs from Western literature, many familiar motifs from Western popular literature, I should say, have found their ways into Satyajit Ray's fiction as well. For instance, we find the vampire in Badur Bibhishika, and the demonic puppet in Bhuto, and so on. And such a motif is doppelganger. Satyajit Ray has written various kinds of short stories. He has trodden on various genres. He has written crime thrillers in Telugu stories. He has written science fantasies in Professor Shumku, and he has written a great number of short stories, which also overlap a great many genres. But one thing among them is constant. He has written about human drama. Satyajit Ray has always attempted to probe into the psyche of human individuals, be it in his cinema or in his literature. And that is where the doppelganger motif becomes very significant. We see how the troublesome double, the double self, the other self, the shadow self, the non-self, that is the doppelganger, how that motif is manifested in various forms in his fiction. What Satyajit Ray wanted to convey through these very manifestations of this motif of doppelganger. Now, before going into Satyajit Ray's dealings with this doppelganger motif, we'd like to discuss a little about the doppelganger itself. What does doppelganger mean, and how it has been represented in throughout human history and literature. Now, doppelganger does not only mean a body double. The word is a German word, which literally means, when translated into English, it means double walker or double goer. Now, it would be wrong to say that doppelganger means only a body double or lookalike. No, doppelganger means something more than that. Doppelganger might mean a lookalike who's not biologically related to the protagonist, the central character, the self, and which has some supernatural connotation about it. The concept of doppelganger can be traced back to the Egyptian mythology, the Greek mythology, Chinese mythology. In the Middle Ages, we find the concept of doppelganger prevalent in various Christian texts, and so on. Of the modern writers, many of them have written about doppelganger. They have used this doppelganger motif. We shall come to it later in our discussion. The first one to use this word doppelganger in literature, in modern literature, and to explain this term doppelganger was Johann Paul Friedrich Richter, who was known by the name Jean-Paul, in his novel Sieben Case. It was published late in the 18th century. And in a footnote of that novel, Sieben Case, he explains the word doppelganger first time in literature as, I quote in German, so heißen Leute, die sich selbst sehen, which means, so people who see themselves are called. Now, there can be very natural reasons of existence of two similar looking human individuals, for instance, the twin brothers and so on. But as I say, the doppelganger motif means something more. According to universal law, no two human individuals can be exactly the same. And the same law applies to the doppelganger as well. Only that in this case, the doppelganger has traditionally been looked upon as the opposite of the central person. Western mythology and culture traditionally portrayed the doppelganger as a shadow existence, which is portentous of loss, misery, misfortune, and even death. A shadow of a self which has a self of its own by some inexplicable supernatural means. Now, without going into further theoretical discourse, we can say the doppelganger motif is founded on the self versus other discourse. And the interesting point is that if we consider ourselves the self, the human individual, is interested in doppelganger and cannot understand the doppelganger primarily because it is an other which is very much like the self. And the confusing point is it is another self, looks like me, which acts on itself, which can act by itself, which has its own agency. Now, the border between the self and the other is blurred in the doppelganger motif. And we can say the doppelganger is a manifestation of the subconscious self, which contrasts the conscious mind we acknowledge as the self. It is here that the doppelganger motif ceases dallying with mere physical similarities and starts accommodating the nature and psychological nuances of human individuals. The doppelganger, strictly speaking, might be or might not be a similar looking body double, but undeniably both the selves emerge out of the same individual psyche. To put it plainly, the doppelganger is an alter ego of the self. The very name alter ego itself encapsulates the essence of the self versus other discourse that I mentioned. Our doppelganger is made of all the dark elements existing within our own psyche, but which we want to denounce, which we want to slip beneath the carpet of the presentable self, which in turn is constructed of the agreeable elements chosen by and from our conscious mind. That is our self. That is the self we want to present to the world. And the doppelganger is the very opposite of this coin. Now, we should come to two persons who first started academic discussions on this doppelganger motif. The first one is Otto Rung, a German psychologist, who, in his treatise Der Doppelganger, or the Doppelganger in 1914, asserts the concept of the doppelganger as dual selves is ratified in the worldwide cultural, religious, and literary acknowledgement of the dichotomy between the body and the soul. How? It has been traditionally acknowledged culturally, religiously, and through literature that the body is the self, the body is the social self, and the soul is the shadow of the self, the body. The shadow has its own agency. Rung says that in the acknowledgement of this dichotomy, this duality, lies the ratification, lies the acknowledgement of the doppelganger as well. The doppelganger, who's also a shadow who can act on itself, which has an agency of itself. Now, Sigmund Freud, in his celebrated essay Das Unheimliche, or the Uncanny, as it is translated into English, published in 1999, corroborated Rung's view by analyzing a short story by E.T.A. Hoffmann, the German author E.T.A. Hoffmann, the short story Der Sandmann, or the Sandman. He reached the conclusion that wherever lies or can lie beyond the knowledge of human experience are elements of fear to mankind, as those things are essentially the reflections of the subconscious mind, which the conscious self tries to subdue. And therefore, all those elements the conscious self is trying to subdue are potentially dangerous for the safe existence of the conscious self. Doppelganger is one of those elements. He analyzes the story The Sandman by E.T. Hoffmann precisely in order to dissect this doppelganger motif. Now, if we look at the classical doppelganger motif, the classical doppelganger literature, for instance, The Double by Dostoevsky, La Hall to a certain extent by Maupassant, William Wilson by Poe, and so on, we would see that predominantly they exploited this doppelganger motive to expound this particular thing, the crisis of the self, the existential crisis in the battle of this dueling dual selves, I should say. Now, I would refer to two more modern scholars. The first one is Andrew J. Weber. Andrew J. Weber, in his book, in the introduction of his book, The Doppelganger, Double Visions in German Literature, identifies a good many, some 9 characteristics of the doppelganger motif in literature. I would refer to a few, 2 or 3 of them. First, the doppelganger is a figure of visual compulsion. In the visual field, the self-seeing subject beholds its other self as another, or alternatively, is beheld as object by its other self. Number 2, characteristics number 2, knowledge and sexuality are the 2 predominant forms of the power play between ego and the alter ego. The doppelganger stories are also about such issues as tutelage, surrogacy, and subordination. Number 3, the doppelganger is typically the product of a broken home. It represents dysfunction in structured well-being, and here broken home does not literally refer to a dysfunctional family merely, but may well include the unfulfilled wishes and failures in life as well, which might lead to fragmental existences of the self. The last one, Guy Fauerholt, in his paper Self as Other, the Doppelganger, published in 2009, observes, I quote, "This logic of repetition and contrast is brought to an extreme in the doppelganger motif's explicit duplication and division of the protagonist. The identical alter ego representing a complete likeness and the split personality representing absolute contrast. However, rather than accentuating and developing the character of the protagonist, the doppelganger poses a threat to his existence because his unique identity is imperiled either by the indistinguishable sameness of the identical alter ego or by the antithesis of the split personality. The doppelganger is indeed a harbinger of death because its presence threatens to annul the identity of its host." Unquote. Now, we can see that the concept of doppelganger accommodates a number of multi-layered battling pairs of ideas. There are multiple contrasting battling pairs of ideas. The entire self and its fragments, the achievements and failures, and they all are taking place within the same individual psyche. And above all, the conscious self versus the other self, the shadow self, the non-self, threatening the self within the same psychological cocoon. Now, after this brief introduction to the doppelganger motif in general, let us start our discussion on Satyajit Ray. I gave this introduction only in order to pave the background. Satyajit Ray introduced the doppelganger motif in his fiction along these very lines. One typical nature of the doppelganger, as can be observed in its cultural depiction worldwide is that the second self, invested with the powers of darkness, lures the self, the I, into evil ways and his ultimate ruin. The doppelganger is often the harbinger of devilry, not only death, but a devilish fortune. Let us start with Satyajit Ray's one of the unique doppelganger stories. Here, Satyajit Ray portrays a doppelganger who is not a human being. And such kind of doppelgangers are also quite commonly found in world literature. For instance, the dilapidated house in Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, or the eponymous picture in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, the story I am referring to perhaps has the latter, the Picture of Dorian Gray, as its influence. The story is Sahadev Babu's portrait. Sahadev Babu's portrait. Here we find the portrait as the doppelganger of Sahadev Babu, and this portrait we see is leading him to ruin. Sahadev Babu is a Novorish gentleman with a weakness for social status. He buys from an auction house an old portrait of an unknown Bengali zamindar, which has an uncanny resemblance with himself. Now, the zamindar in the portrait differs from Sahadev Babu only in social status, opulence, and aristocratic attitude. And Sahadev Babu enters a crazy game of becoming identical with the portrait in terms of behavior, attitude, nature, and physical appearance. Generally, what happens is the other way around. We want our portrait to look like ourselves. Here the thing goes the other way around. The human individual tries to become like the portrait. Sahadev Babu undergoes a makeover, a huge, massive makeover, and while undergoing this makeover, he faces a huge economical loss. Speaking metaphorically, the portrait feeds upon the poison of this materialistic opulence grown in Sahadev Babu. And the climax reveals to the reader that it was actually the portrait of Sahadev Babu himself. Only that the artist, who was once rejected by Sahadev Babu, imagined him in the background of the ancient Zamindari culture in this paint. Sahadev Babu did not know that when he bought that portrait or mounted the portrait in his bedchamber as a status symbol in order to satisfy his own narcissism. A man immersed in the thought of gaining more social respect by means of materialistic opulence, Sahadev Babu could not recognize his own portrait. And this can be taken as a metaphor for his inability to recognize his own self. He does not know himself. He had deliberately tried to erase the memory of his past life, the past life of impoverishment, and he clung on to more and more money. He forgot, he deliberately shut out all his old friends and so on. And the portrait, in a sense, resonates with that materialistic, self-centered Sahadev Babu. And at the same time, it comes to him as a nemesis. He's a copybook, evil doppelganger, leading the self to destruction. Self here means Sahadev Babu, the human individual. And as if the portrait's sole purpose was to destroy Sahadev Babu in the insatiable fire of social prosperity burning within Sahadev Babu. Sahadev Babu realized that on the verge of becoming bankrupt, that the portrait is trying to destroy himself and the portrait is using his own insatiable thirst for more and more power, social respect as the instrument of destruction. I quote from the story. Sahadev Babu stared once more at the portrait. This is what is happening near the climax of the story. I quote, Sahadev Babu stared once more at the portrait. In a few minutes, the feeling that rose uppermost in his heart was one he had never experienced before. It was fear. The man's lips held a slight smile. Until now, it had always struck him as a pleasant smile. Tonight, it seemed evil. And at the end of the story, Sahadev Babu redeems himself by returning the portrait to the auction house from which he had bought it. And thus he rids himself of the misfortune brought about by the narcissism, infatuation for social status. Though the mystery of the portrait's uncanny resemblance with Sahadev Babu is revealed to the reader, the ambience of the uncanny prevailing overall the story definitely calls for the aura of the supernatural generally associated with the doppelganger motif. But besides considering this story as merely as a fantasy or horror story, this can be taken as a morality story as well. Satyajit Ray, after all, as I have already said, is portraying human minds. Is he trying to forewarn the readers through this morality story that if you don't check your own thirst for more and more, you also might land in this mess? Satyajit Ray was never a didactic person, but then again, we can discover newer ages, newer angles in his stories. Now, I will move on to another, or I should say, to one of the most famous characters created by Satyajit Ray, Professor Shumku. Professor Shumku, we know the sage-like inventor, scientist residing in Girirdi, who has an international exposure. And in this story, which is, in my opinion, one of the finest doppelganger stories in world literature, we find Professor Shumku in a very difficult situation. And in this story, we would see Satyajit Ray was very much concerned with the doppelganger's motive, the doppelganger motive's explicit duplication and division of the protagonist, as Dry Flowerwood has said. The story is Shonkur Shonir Dosha, translated in English, The Black Night of Professor Shumku. Now, here we find a lookalike of Shumku destroying the honor and reputation of Professor Shumku by vilifying a group of eminent scientists in an international public conference at Vienna. And the body double even makes Shumku appear as a murderer. People around Shumku can see or encounter the false Shumku, but they are unable to recognize him as false, which leads to an existential crisis for the real Shumku. Now, as the false Shumku starts chasing and threatening the existence of the real Shumku, the real Professor Shumku, the self, has no option left but to chase out this doppelganger and finish it off. This chase and finish game, which is the pivot of the story, itself is suggestive of the struggle for power between the self and the other self, the alter ego. And very curiously, at the very outset of the story, we find Satyajit Ray making an astrologer forewarn Shumku of this impending slander. And this astrologer asks Shumku to destroy his biggest enemy in order to get rid of this misfortune. And when Shumku asks the astrologer who that enemy is, his biggest enemy, he answers, this is very important, this is very significant. The astrologer answers that it is Shumku himself. He says, Tumi nije, you yourself. Here, Satyajit Ray, with impeccable mastery of a literature who has seen much of life, we see he deftly introduces one most crucial point concerning human existence and duality of selves. In this story, apparently meant for teenagers. Now, not many commonplace human individuals have or show the courage to stand up and face the reflections of their own darker psyche straight away. Not many of us has the courage of confronting ourselves, the darkness within our own psyche. Shumku does, or at least Satyajit Ray makes Shumku do that in this story, and that is why the common men like us, the readers, want Shumku to come out victorious in this battle against the evil doppelganger, which is metaphorically the battle of the two selves that we always have within ourselves. And the climax of the story reveals the doppelganger of Shumku to be an android, a robot. The creator of the robot is Hans Gropius, a scientist envious of Shumku's achievements, and the mastermind behind this conspiracy, which attempted to jeopardize Shumku's prestige, honor, even life. Now, the curious thing is, if we remove the factor of physical resemblance in the doppelganger, now we find Shumku's self had been hitherto combating not a false Shumku, not a double Shumku, but Hans Gropius. It is Hans Gropius who's the antagonist here, not the robot Shumku. In other words, behind the doppelganger robot Shumku, it is Hans Gropius who emerges as the evil alter ego of Professor Shumku. Hans Gropius does not resemble Shumku physically, but the robot he projects, the robot he creates out of his spite, his envy for Professor Shumku resembles Professor Shumku, the doppelganger, the lookalike. Gropius, we see, perfectly fits the bill of the contrastive doppelganger, the evil other. We are told that time and again he found himself defeated by Shumku's talent. Time and again he invented many things only to discover that those things were already patented by Shumku. He has always felt snubbed by Shumku's achievement. Shumku, though inadvertently, has broken Gropius's home many times, leading Gropius in the path of revenge by unfair means. Now, the frustrated intention of beating, surpassing Shumku turns Gropius into Shumku's shadow self, non-self, out of which emerges this monstrous robot, this evil doppelganger of Professor Shumku. Satyajit Ray uses a very interesting trope here as well. The only distinguishing characteristic that this false Shumku has, we are told, is that the false Shumku wears glasses with tinted glasses. The spectacles of this false Shumku is of tinted glass. We can't see the eye of this false Shumku. Now, we are told that the eyes are the mirror of the mind. The eyes of this false Shumku can't be seen, so we can't see what is going inside the mind, inside the heart, inside the self of Shumku, the double Shumku, or to say so, Gropius. And extending this line of thought a little farther, this false Shumku is the projection of the dark mind or the dark vision of Gropius. Perhaps this tinted glass of this false Shumku, this robot Shumku, is a metaphor for this dark self of Gropius. One common trait that becomes apparent in the doppelgangers of Professor Shumku, the doppelgangers Satyajit Ray creates, is that these alter egos want to surpass, overpower, and dominate their primary selves. Gropius wants to beat Shumku through his android doppelganger, and so on. We would go on to another Professor Shumku story. Professor Shumku or Robu, it's called in Bengali, Professor Shumku and Robo in English. There also we find another robot doppelganger, this time not of Professor Shumku, but of another robot scientist, robot researcher, German robot researcher called Gottfried Borgelt. Dr. Gottfried Borgelt wanted his robot to be his own second self. He wanted his robot to resemble himself, both physically and intellectual capacity as well. But it so happened that this robo, looking like Professor Borgelt, he overpowered and imprisoned Borgelt, and as an imposter, met Professor Shumku. He became a nearly self-thinking being. The robot, it became a nearly self-thinking being. And it so happened that the actual point of danger in the doppelganger motive lies in this ominous probability of this second self's procuring of power equal to, if not more than, the original self. At the end of the story, this robot is defeated, destroyed by Shumku's own robot, who is called Robu. But the moot point of the story that Satyajit Ray is trying to underline, perhaps, is that when he makes Borgelt say this, we can understand. Borgelt declares, when I built my own robot, I made it so much like myself and gave it so many human qualities that it began to resent its own creator. It simply didn't want another being to be present who was exactly like him. This is the principal point in all the doppelganger fiction. Perhaps these lines, these words spoken by Borgelt, should be taken as a confession of the collective conscience of man, the thought of a carbon copy of I, the ego, the individual, existing somewhere out there and also outside the perimeter of our epistemic experience altogether, is indeed unbearable. It makes us nervous. It shatters the firm basis of our existence. When our reflection in the mirror starts behaving independently, we become terror-struck. And maybe we can say, this is another point, through this story, Satyajit Ray is also forewarning us, mankind in general, of our growing dependence on technology. Perhaps he was warning mankind that you are making a doppelganger world of your humanity. The virtual world that we live today, is it not a virtual look-alike of the real world of humanity we once used to know? This world of social media, the virtual world, is this not the doppelganger, the shadow existence, the shadow other self of the real world we know we live in? And this is undeniable that today, this technology, this virtual world, this is eating up our real world of friendship, of relationships. If this is not a virtual doppelganger self, I don't know what is. Satyajit Ray did not know about Facebook and virtual world in his time when this story was being written in 1960s. That was unthinkable. Mobile phones was unthinkable. But today, we read the story and we find the uncanny resemblance with our world today. I would move on to a doppelganger motif we find in one of our Feluda stories now. That the doppelganger motif is used to delineate the fear, we have already discussed that. And Satyajit Ray adeptly makes use of precisely this terror in order to portray the inherent evil within man in his novel Jotokando Kathmandute, The Criminals of Kathmandu. In this mystery adventure of Feluda series, we encounter Mr. Anantalal Batra. Mr. Anantalal Batra is a prosperous businessman from Kathmandu. His life becomes something of a hell due to the mischiefs of a doppelganger. And Anantalal Batra begs Feluda for help. The climax reveals a wonderful fact that there never existed any second self, any doppelganger of Anantalal Batra. And a spine-chilling revelation dawns upon the reader that the lamb-like gentleman, Anantalal Batra himself, is Jagdish, the murderer, the henchman of Feluda's arch-enemy Maganlal Meghraj, the in charge of Maganlal Meghraj's businesses of counterfeit money and drugs, and above all, the rogue doppelganger, whose disturbance supposedly compelled Batra to consult Feluda. There was no Jagdish after all. There was Anantalal Batra. That is to say, the very characteristics Batra imposed on Jagdish are actually indicative of his own character, his own self. The question then arises. The question then the reader confronts this question: which is the actual self of this person then? Who is the real man, Batra or Jagdish? The answer would obviously be the criminal. The border between Jagdish and Anantalal Batra becomes blurred. And here we get to know once again how exceptionally well Satyajit Ray was conversant with human psychology. The doppelganger motif in literature not only refers to explicit duplication and division of the protagonist, but also leads the reader to sympathize with the central self, the self of the protagonist, who is very realistically suffering from insecurity. It is William Wilson that we sympathize with in Edgar Allan Poe's story. Satyajit Ray knows this, and that is why he leads his readers by hand into sympathizing with believing in the realistic gentleman Batra. At the end of the story, we see Feluda analyzing the mystery and saying, Batra could guess that should Shom get killed, I'm quoting here, that Batra could guess that should Shom get killed, I would be asked to make an investigation. He didn't know then that we would run into each other by purely an accident. But when we did, the idea of creating a double occurred to him immediately. It was a very clever idea. The next day, he came to my house in the evening to convince me of the existence of this double. The day after that, he killed Shom. He left the cookery behind to make me think that the murder was the fake Mr. Batra. That means, unquote, that means Batra was not creating any evil double of himself, as the reader has all along thought that it is Batra who's speaking of his evil double. No, it's not that thing. Rather, here the case is the very other way around. The evil criminal, Jagadish, Batra Jagadish, which we can call him, Jagadish was creating his own socially presentable good doppelganger, Anantalal Batra. Here, the transaction between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is essentially an intended and intentional one. There is no psychological mystery at all. Jagdish very clearly, very intentionally invents Batra, becomes Batra. Satyajit Ray succeeds in making this devilish scheme of Jagdish Anantalal become a success because he has human psychology at his fingertips. He knows very well that the reader is a common man who would inevitably extend his sympathies to anyone with the commonness and weakness of a fellow common man. When in distress, what will such a common man like the reader would do? He or she would, of course, turn to a larger-than-life like figure like Feluda, as Anantalal Batra has done. Therefore, in the reader's eyes, very easily Batra becomes the close and credible common man, and Jagadish is evil doppelganger. And that is how we find Satyajit Ray creating another masterpiece of his crime mystery thriller series. It is that Satyajit Ray is playing on man's perception of the binary between good and evil. He knows, Satyajit Ray knows that man loves to think of self and doppelganger in terms of binary opposites, dichotomy, self versus other. He knows that man does not really wish to acknowledge that the border between good and bad, the battling selves, can be actually blurred. He creates this masterpiece of Feluda series based on that understanding of mankind, of the common Bengali readers. Which one is the real self and which one the alter ego? We don't understand. So that is another way of saying Satyajit Ray was already pointing at the fact that there can exist multiple alter egos besides this commonly accepted notion of one alter ego within the same psychological cocoon. And we don't know which one the real self is. He has elevated this concept of multiple doppelgangers to a marvelous dimension in one of his short stories called Ratan Babu Ar Shei Lokta, Ratan Babu and That Man. With discussion of this short story, I shall close discussion of today. This short story, in my opinion, is one of the finest psychological horror stories ever written on the doppelganger motif in world literature. Now, the very title betrays the nature of this story. Ratan Babu and That Man. Ratan Babu Ar Shei Lokta. As if Ratan Babu, the protagonist, is being weighed on a scale against an unknown, mysterious person. That man. Who that man is, we really don't. We come to know that he is the doppelganger. That man is so balanced against Ratan Babu that they share the same birthday, the same amount of salary, the same likings, same dislikes. And they are so much alike that the other man's name also matches the name of Ratan Babu. Ratanlal, Monilal. That man is called Monilal. Both Ratan and Moni means jewel. Now, Ratan Babu is a man of solitary nature, and he is happily so, because his likings and nature, they do not match with anybody else's. And at some point, he did wish to have a friend of the same wavelength of mind with whom he would be able to share his likings, his dislikes. He has never been able to find one. We can say, we can analyze that perhaps his inability of finding a perfect bosom friend emerges out of his own narcissism. He's too much in love with himself. Self-centered a man he is. Self-centered. The term can be taken very literally. And precisely that is why when he encounters Monilal Babu, his mirror image, this narcissistic self becomes too much shaken and scared to acknowledge that an exact duplicate of itself does exist. He meets Monilal Babu, an exact mirror image of himself, and suddenly his urge of having a fellow-minded friend evaporates. Not only evaporate, it gives way to deep angst and existential crisis. I quote, he realized he was better off as he was, alone, without a friend. He didn't need a friend, or at any rate, not someone like Monilal Babu. He couldn't rid himself of the feeling that it would have been better if Monilal Babu hadn't come into his life. Even if two identical men existed, it was wrong that they should meet. The very thought that they might continue to meet even after returning to Calcutta made Ratan Babu shudder. Unquote. Satyajit Ray is pointing at one of the very basic ironies of human existence, perhaps. We all want to have the world customized as to our liking. We all want to have a world like our own. But the fact remains that if that wish becomes a reality, when we do find exactly what we want, when we have the world exactly like ourselves, that reality becomes unbearable to us, to our conscience. At one point, this existence of Monilal Babu is becoming unbearable to Ratan Babu. Ratan Babu says he didn't. It, it is fruitless to talk to Monilal Babu because he already knows what the answer would be. It is like talking to himself. It is like a redundant self of himself, a photocopy. In this story, the problem remains that this exact duplicate of this commonplace man, Ratan Babu, does not disturb Ratan Babu anyway, direct, actively. Ratan Babu is disturbed psychologically. Monilal Babu was not luring him to any evil destination, nothing. Ratan Babu is a representative of the commonplace human individual and has the hobby of vacationing at very obscure places every year, where there are chances of discovering things which are apparently most ordinary, yet arouses a deep sense of wonder, awe. Why does Satyajit portray Ratan Babu in these colors? Perhaps this question leads us to a deep philosophical understanding. Is there any space more common in our life, in our existence, than our very everyday existence? Perhaps not. And the most wonderful thing to be discovered in that space, that existence, is the I, the ego, the self. For time being, let us put aside the question of which self is the real self. Since the ancient days, the wise men, both of the Western and Oriental philosophy, have been teaching us the value of the maxim, know thyself, temet nosse, atmanam vidhi. And it is most ironical that when that I confronts us in a form of a mirror image, when we see the exact duplicate of ourselves, a replica, a body double, our ego becomes intent on destroying. We can't bear to have that self as the projection outside. That is what happens in the case of Ratan Babu as well. He kills Monilal Babu. He couldn't tolerate it because no common man, we can't tolerate the thought of a quote-unquote self, an existing self, very much looking like myself, which has at the very same time an active separate agency. We can't that thing to exist out there. I can't think of allowing it to exist out there, out in the world. Satyajit Ray masterfully imparts a farther dimension to the doppelganger motif here. Monilal Babu is Ratan Lal's body double, the doppelganger, right? Ratan Babu is a typical lower middle class Bengali gentleman of meager means, meek disposition. He earns 437 rupees per month, a lower division clerk, right? And we know that it is Monilal Babu who is the duplicate, the replica, the doppelganger of Ratan Babu, right? Then, who is that person eventually emerging out of that meek gentleman of Ratan Babu in the course of the story, hatching a scheme of murdering the doppelganger Monilal in a cold-blooded manner within one single afternoon, and executing that plan with such perfection that the murder becomes absolutely unrecognizable? This is the work of a cold-blooded murderer. A murderer who we cannot compare with Ratan Babu, this meek gentleman, right? Technically speaking, this is also an alter ego of Ratan Babu. So we see Satyajit Ray is deliberately breaking away with the traditional concepts associated with the doppelganger motif, that the evil doppelganger has to be somebody visible, and the struggle between the selves is just a binary struggle between the ego and the alter ego. No, he delineates multiple layers in the struggle of selves. He as if says that no, there might be the self, the ego, and multiple alter egos. Not only the duplication and division, but both at the same time. At the climax of the story, Ratan Babu himself is killed in the hands of the spirit of Monilal Babu, and so we can guess even the manner of both deaths are exactly same. Now, who killed Ratan Babu? Really the ghost of this doppelganger Monilal, or Ratan Babu's own alter ego, his own conscience, the alter ego that resides within Ratan Babu himself? Monilal Babu extended his hand to Ratan Babu in friendship. As I was saying, Monilal didn't lure Ratan Babu into any evil, unlike the typical traditional doppelgangers we are accustomed to see in literature. Monilal Babu wished Ratan Babu well, and yet Ratan Babu killed him. At this point, I'm reminded of William Wilson, the eponymous protagonist of Edgar Allan Poe's story, Doppelganger Motif story, William Wilson, who stabbed his own doppelganger to death. And at the climax of that story, William Wilson saw in a mirror the reflection of his own dead doppelganger, who spoke out to him, I quote, "I have lost. Yet from now on, you are also dead. Dead to the world, dead to heaven, dead to hope. In me you lived, and in my death, see by this face, which is your own, how wholly, how completely you have killed yourself." Now, had there been an imaginary face-off between Ratan Babu and Monilal Babu after the murder of the latter, we would have had no difficulty in putting the words of William Wilson's doppelganger, the words I mentioned, in the mouth of Monilal Babu. Satyajit Ray thus has portrayed myriad manifestations of the doppelganger motif in his short stories. I believe time is up, so I won't be able to, and I think it is not probable to get on every story that he has used the doppelganger motif in. I have to leave many stories outside the ambit of today's discussion, like there remained Professor Shumku, Bhuto, Bhakto, the admirer. All these stories employ the doppelganger motif. Perhaps some other time. But one thing with which I would conclude this discussion. One question remains: why the use of these dark tones associated with the doppelganger motif by Satyajit Ray when he was writing these stories primarily for the teenagers, for children? The answer may be that Satyajit Ray never wanted to treat children, the young adults, as they are treated by the adults generally. This view is corroborated by the child actors collaborating with Satyajit Ray as well. They also have acknowledged that he never treated the child actors as children, as adults would treat children. He would always treat them as an adult would treat an adult. Similarly, in the world of literature as well, Satyajit Ray would have wanted the children to be treated as adults. He knew that these children are growing up. They should know the world with all its reality, and reality is often dark. He perhaps wanted to, as he wanted to portray the dark alleyways of human psychology. He wanted to portray those alleyways in the darker tone to the children, to the teenagers as well. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rajarshee, for this wonderful lecture. The presentation of the double trouble in race fiction, as well as the introduction of Doppelganger, really left us amazed. And Shuparna, there is some okay, all right. So, yeah. Is there some echo that I'm facing?
রাজর্ষি দা একটু মিউট করবে
Okay,
কি?
okay. I'm mute.
Could you please keep yourself in mute? So, all right. So now we will take the questions. I think we have a few questions in our chat box. Suparna, kindly show it to us. Yes. The first question is from Oritro Bashu. Just a technical question. How did Shumku manage to get rid of this doppelganger when we know that it was a robot? Is this a mistake by Ray? We know that the annihilating pistol doesn't work on robots. I guess Professor Shumku কোনো একটা অভিযানে এটা বলা হয়েছিল. You on mute, Rajarshee. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, in Shonku's Congo Bhijan, I think Shonku couldn't destroy the Mokele Mbembe because it was a robot. Oritro has asked this, right? Yes. Well, I really don't know the answer. Perhaps Satyajit Ray himself is the one who could give this answer. This is perhaps one of the lesser flaws in the Shonku saga, and the Professor Shonku saga is full of such flaws. This is I am in no way responsible for that. Oritro knows that answer very well. This is the discrepancy. This is the discrepancy.
And they will be there actually. And we readers have to find them. All right. So the next question, Shuparna. Yes, this is from Olivsha Shorkar. She asks, how is the doppelganger different from the evil that we have in ourselves? Is the conflict between the self and the doppelganger, or the alter ego, the conflict between good and evil in ourselves? I think you have answered a little bit of this question.
Yes, already.
If you would like to say something about this, if you would like to say something.
You see, there is this. Am I audible? Yeah. See, from the discussion we have had, I think this much is clear that there is a connection between doppelganger and alter ego. Now, alter ego, by the very term, it is clear that the alter ego is the opposite of the ego. Ego is self. And doppelganger is not that two-dimensional an idea. The doppelganger accommodates both the alter ego and the points of similarity as well. That is the point of confusion and interest in doppelganger. It both accommodates the points which we reject, which we try to denounce, and at the same time, the doppelganger accommodates the similarities that we love so very much. The classical example is perhaps Ratan Babu or Shei Lokta. The very question is that is Monilal Babu can Monilal Babu be considered the doppelganger of Ratanlal? He is the doppelganger, but is he the alter ego? Perhaps not. That is the moot point. Monilal is not Ratanlal's alter ego. He is very much the duplicate of the ego of Ratanlal. That is what shaking up Ratanlal. What is the alter ego of Ratan Babu? We find killing Monilal. That is the alter ego. That is Mr. Hyde of Ratan Babu. Ratan Babu তিনি ছাপোষা কেরানি, তার ভেতর থেকে যে লোকটা খুন করবার জন্য উঠে আসছে সে হচ্ছে অল্টার ইগো। এই দুইকে মিলিয়ে হচ্ছে ডপেলগ্যাঙ্গার, দি অল্টার ইগো and the duplicate self, we may call it. I think Polipsha has been.
I think that answers. Yes, that answers her question. So the next one is from Suparna. Why do you think the doppelganger is mostly portrayed as evil? Is it solely a Western tendency?
This calls for a detailed discussion. We have to look into the chronology of the doppelganger, the representation of doppelganger throughout culture. See, without going into the theoretical details, we all know what otherization is. And when our ancestors who first conceived of the doppelganger, they didn't consider a doppelganger, they didn't conceive the doppelgangers as very near and dear ones. Why would you conceive of an idea of a self who is very much like yourself? Your doppelganger is not your offspring. You would like your offspring to be good. Your offspring through whom you live. Your doppelganger is not such an entity. Your doppelganger is a duplicate self of yourself, of ourselves. And we always know that we, human individuals, can't be good at all the time. Our epistemic, no, I'm not going into the theoretical details. Our knowledge of ourselves, our world, our existence tells us that no human being can be good altogether. So if there exists a duplicate copy of ourselves out there in the world, human individuals or collectively human beings, we are always under the threat that it is the dark side of ourselves that would be betrayed. From that fear, the doppelganger becomes evil. You see, another psychological pressure operates here. We always try to, well, we all have read Freud here. We know the concepts of id, ego, and superego. We know that superego tries to subdue id, whereas we all know that it is the id that is perhaps the most real thing within ourselves. We want ourselves, our ego, to be to have a presentable face. And at the same time, we know that these selves are not actually as presentable as we want them to be, as we want them to appear. Now, here, if we imagine the doppelganger self to be an evil self, it gives us an advantage of shifting the weight of all the evil doing on that second self. It is like saying, I have not done this. That persona, that shadow self of mine has done this. Precisely this is the psychological trait. This psychological characteristic is what Satyajit Ray banks on when he was writing Jotokando Kathmandu. As if Anantolal Batra appeared to Feluda saying, I have not murdered Anikendra Shok. That doppelganger. Jagdish has murdered. Jagdish is the henchman of Mohanlal Meghraj. Whereas actually we know that there is no difference between Jagdish and Anantalal. When Jagdish is creating Anantalal, or vice versa, we can call it, the shift, the weight of the crime is shifted on Jagdish, the doppelganger. Perhaps this is the reason why doppelganger is mostly portrayed as evil. That gives humanity a way out to slip away from the darkness of the darkness existing within mankind. I don't know whether that satisfies your question or not.
I think that answers our
Is
question.
it solely a Western tendency? Well, mostly so. The doppelganger generally is a Western tendency. In Indian literature, we find very few mentions of the doppelganger. At least the discussion that today we had, that I have built on the Western understanding of doppelganger.
Thank you, Rajarshee.
The idea of doppelganger is mostly a German one. If you
Yes.
yes, yes,
All
yes.
right. The next question is again from Auditro Basu. He is asking, in stories like Bhakto, Tollywood Tarini Kuro, Maharaja
Maharaja
Tarini Kuro,
Taraniki.
etc., there exists no direct conflict between the person and the doppelganger. How is the ego clash justified?
The ego clash is, I would say, in Bhakto it is justified. In Bhakto it is justified. In Bhakto, it is a curious case of the doppelganger motif. You see, the entire story is told from the perspective of the doppelganger. In Bhakto, we find that who's the name of the protagonist is Arup Babu, I believe. Arup Babu is the doppelganger. It is a comedy story. It's a comic story. Arup Babu is taken for the famous children's author. What's his name? Aparesh Maulik, I believe. And his existence, we can understand, is jeopardizing the existence of the real self. Both the real self of Mr. Maulik, at the very end of the story, we find Maulik and Arup Babu meeting. And when Arup Babu tells Maulik that these people, they have accepted Arup Babu as Aparesh Maulik, Aparesh or Amolesh, I don't remember the name exactly. Mr. Moulik is quite disturbed. Mr. Moulik is quite astounded to first to meet this body double of himself, and to acknowledge that this man is taken for himself by the children. And at the same time, this is very interesting. Arup Babu's self is also jeopardized. Arup Babu, how would he himself? How would he project himself as Arup Babu to the children? Where does Arup Babu stand? To the children, it is Maulik in the form of Arup Babu that appears. Where is the self of Arup Babu? The self of Arup Babu has no existence in front of the children. The clash between the self and the double is perhaps resolved in the very comical resolution of Omolesh Maulik shaving off his mustache. In Tollywood, Tarini Khuro and Maharaja Tarini Khuro. Well, first of all, Maharaja Tarini Khuro, I would put that story more in the genre of horror fiction, and the doppelganger motif is not that much exploited to the fullest extent, I would say. Maybe Satyajit Ray was having an influence of Prisoner of Zenda. That much. And Tollywood Tarini Khudo, well, is the doppelganger motive very much expounded there? I don't know. I don't, honestly speaking, the doppelganger motive in that particular story, I myself believe to be an imposed one. Satyajit Ray could have pulled that off in better. That is my personal opinion. That is the story in which the physical similarities between Tarini Khudo and that young actor, I have forgotten his name, that is not that much harped upon. That is one very important point in the doppelganger motive, that the similarity between the two selves should be visible. Not only visible, it has to be reminded time and again. In this story, Tollywood Tarini Khudo, that is not that much harped upon. So I don't believe the doppelganger motive has been exploited that much in the story.
Thank you so much. Do you have any more questions, Shuparna?
No, we don't have any questions anymore.
All right. Thank you so much, Rajarshee, for this excellent lecture. The title was so interesting, and your lecture actually kept that charm throughout. And now I would request Shuparna, and I would apologize to a few of our viewers who wanted this lecture in Bengali, but as we had shared the poster in English, so we could not uh, make some of our audiences feel abandoned from this lecture, as raise so much an interesting topic for everyone, I guess. So now I would request
এটা
Shuparna.
বাংলায় না, আমি এখানে একটা কথা জাস্ট বলে দিই, যেটা তোমাদের সঙ্গে কথা হয়েছিল, বাইলিঙ্গুয়াল করা যেত, কিন্তু সেটা হলে this lecture would have been another 1.5 hour long.
And আর হয়তো বাংলায়
তাতে
শুরু
কোনো
করলে
লাভ হতো
হয়তো
না।
আরো বেশি বলা হয়ে আরো হয়তো এগিয়ে যেত।
তাও অনেক গল্প বাকি পড়ে রইলো। এটা তো মানে জাস্ট কয়েকটা মেইন গল্পকে নিয়ে আমি বললাম, আরো অনেকগুলো গল্প বাকি রইলো। ভক্ত, যেমন আমি আমি ভেবেছিলাম প্রথমে ভক্তকে ইনক্লুড করব, কিন্তু তারপর দেখলাম ডার্কার টোনের সঙ্গে ভক্ত ঠিক যাচ্ছে না। ঠিক আছে, পরে কখন হবে। ভক্ত বাকি রইলো, ভূত বাকি রইলো, প্রফেসর শঙ্কু ভূত, আরো অনেক বাকি পড়ে রইলো। বলতে গেলে এই নিয়ে অনেক অনেক বলা যায়, এবং বলতে গেলে আর থামা যায় না।
আর বারবার ডপলগ্যাঙ্গার ডিসকাস করতে করতে তোমার আর আমার একটা কনভারসেশন আমার মনে পড়ছিল, দ্যাট ইউ হ্যাভ আ ডপলগ্যাঙ্গার ইন ইউর লাইফ অ্যাজ ওয়েল।
We all have.
উই অল
We all have within ourselves. এটাই তো কথা,
অলরাইট,
ডপলগ্যাঙ্গার মোটিভটা এত ইন্টারেস্টিং। Thank
এত
you.
ইন্টারেস্টিং।
Thanks to CC 1919 for inviting me to deliver this lecture. Let's call this a discussion. I don't know what a lecture is. I didn't intend this to be a lecture.
A lecture as well as a discussion.
Yeah.
All right, now
Thank you.
I would
Thank
request
you.
Shuparna to kindly end with the vote of thanks. Shuparna.
On behalf of Calcutta Comparatists 1919 and its members, I would like to convey our hearty thanks to Professor Rajarshee Gupta for his excellent lecture on the topic The Doppelganger Motif in Satyajit Ray's fiction. I would like to express our gratitude to you, sir, for responding to us and coming to our forum. We are really inspired by your great talk. Thank you to all of our audiences on YouTube for being with us today. Here we officially conclude this session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.